As the bitter memories of the reunification war began to fade, the Star League transitioned into the next chapter of its existence, commonly referred to as either the Good Years, the Century of Peace, or the Golden Age. This period of relative calm lasted for most of the 27th century, with only a few disturbances along the way. During this time, the Star League soared to undreamt of new heights and all benefited from its advancements. There was, however, a spectre hanging over the League, and as humanity entered the 28th century, the cracks began to surface. The 3 hidden wars of the Star League would bring it to the brink, and the 2 succession crises shook the High Council. Before long, old resentments flared up, and the member states were at each other's throats. Only a great statesman such as First Lord Cameron had a chance of overcoming the turmoil and binding the disparate nations back together. All this, however, was over 100 years away when Nicholas Cameron became the Star League's new First Lord in 2602. He would rule for the better part of 5 decades throughout the period known as the Good Years, but it would be a mistake to think that this was a time free from strife. The name comes not from the fact that the new Star League was perfect, but rather that those issues humanity faced were resolved without the use of war, a stark contrast to the preceding 200 years of history. By far the largest threat faced by the Star League in the aftermath of the Reunification War was an internal one. For decades, Leonard Kurita had been touring his realm, visiting houses of ill repute and siring many illegitimate children. In the early 27th century, he became obsessed with the idea of tracking them all down, and dispatched his military on pointless errands to find them. It did not go unnoticed that the direction he dispatched many of them in was towards the Terran Hegemony. This foolish act of hostility became deadly serious when in February 2602, the Third Sword of Light landed on Asta, a jointly held world and demilitarized zone. The DCMS forces departed before the SLDF arrived, with a dozen children in tow. When questioned on his actions, Leonard accused the First Lord of trying to keep his children from him. Tensions only grew from there, and Ian Cameron, in one of his last acts as First Lord, dispatched the newly formed 10th Corps to fortify the border. Such was the threat to the stability of the Star League. In 2604, things came to a climactic head. During a High Council meeting, Leonard lunged at Nicholas Cameron, repeating the accusations about his stolen children. After the two were separated by the other Council Lords, Leonard threw his wine bottle at the First Lord. One of his guards, Tanya Kerensky, interposed herself between the bottle and her lord, but when she was hit, she accidentally discharged her weapon, which came within a hair's breadth of hitting the coordinator. Leonard drew a knife and attacked Kerensky, fatally stabbing her twice, then fled the scene. Back on New Samarkand, Kurita began preparations for all-out war. By February 2605, his fleet and attendant army had finished mustering at Benjamin and was about to launch an offensive when Leonard mysteriously took ill. His campaign never began, as the coordinator died a few weeks later. Nobody took credit for what everyone knew was an assassination, but decades later it was discovered to be the work of Sidwin McAllister, Leonard's grandmother. In the aftermath, Leonard's son Blaine took on the role of coordinator, but passed away later that year. So it was that Sidwin McAllister became coordinator of the Draconis Combine for the third time in her life, aged 108. On December 7, 2607, the 4 Periphery realms were inducted into the Star League as associate members. By this point, the reconstruction efforts within the territorial states had been underway for 10 years. Many Innisphere businesses had been enticed to set up new operations out in the periphery to take advantage of cheap labour and plentiful resources. At first there had been some controversy over the fact that it was Innisphere companies who were getting the Star League contracts and not local businesses, but as the balance improved, the member states would soon find themselves in economic trouble. First to feel the pinch was the Capellan Confederation. As the only realm that had not taken part in the fighting, they benefited the least from the post-war boom. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Chancellor Ursula Liao had taken advantage of the fact that the SLDF's best route for reaching the magistracy in Concordat took them through Capellan space, and began charging the so-called cattle tax for each soldier crossing our borders. When the war ended and this massive source of revenue dried up, the Capellan economy reeled. Ursula Liao passed away just before the turn of the century and had no children to take up the post of Chancellor. It fell to the Prefectorate to nominate a replacement, and they made the unconventional choice of Norman Aris, the last survivor of the family that had once ruled the Capellan hegemony 300 years earlier. This decision was largely a placatory one, as the Liao family had become deeply unpopular within the Star League as a result of Ursula's actions and her inaction in other regards. To save his nation from economic collapse, Aris implemented a number of aggressive state socialist economic policies that gave him the ability to uproot entire family groups, retrain them for an assigned role, and then deploy them to any world as needed. The Capellan citizens would have to sacrifice their freedoms for the good of the state. While these policies ultimately succeeded, and by 2610 the economy had recovered, these freedoms were never reinstated. The Capellan Chancellor still has this power today. The ruling family within the Lyran Commonwealth was caught in a vicious feud in the early 27th century. Kevin Steiner Dinason's father Robert had died back in 2597, not long after the death of Kevin's mother the Archon, while en route to Tharkad to serve as an advisor. At the time, his death was ruled natural, but over the next dozen years, 11 more prominent members of the Dinason family, plus 7 Steiners, would drop dead under mysterious circumstances. Kevin began 2611 by reforming the Estates General for the first time in almost 2 decades after his mother disbanded them in the wake of Henry Graham's attempted coup. The following year, he launched an investigation into the deaths of his family members, which ultimately concluded that the Dinasons were responsible for trying to supplant the ruling Steiners. The outcome of this led Kevin to drop the Dinason half of his name. Though his sister, who would become Archon after him, still used the Steiner Dinason name, she would be the last to do so. In the 2620s, the Star League proposed the idea of a unified currency to ease the challenges involved in trading between nations. Most were in support of the idea, but Kevin Steiner feared that this would weaken the Lyran position and used his executive powers to overrule his own government. In response, mass strikes broke out across the Commonwealth, forcing the Archon to back down. In 2623, the Star League dollar, sometimes called the Cameron Bill or Sea Bill, became the official currency of the League. The last major event that happened within the Lyran quadrant of space almost changed the face of the Inner Sphere as we know it. By 2643, things were going so well for the Star League that many within the Commonwealth were questioning whether its continued existence was even necessary. Why were they paying for 2 bureaucracies when the Star League alone would suffice? This movement swept through the Estates General until it seemed almost certain that they would vote themselves out of existence. Only the last-minute impassioned plea by the Archon himself won the day for the Commonwealth. The final voting results were 160 for dissolution and 161 against. It's impossible to predict how history might have changed had it gone the other way. Kevin Steiner passed away 4 years later in 2647. In the Draconis Combine, Sidera McAllister's third stint as coordinator was brought to a premature end when her ministers essentially forced her into retirement. Her wisdom and authority was unquestioned, but her advanced age made running the Combine a real challenge for her. Nevertheless, her choice of replacement, Leonard Kurita, gave her someone who she could continue to pull the strings of and rule by proxy. Leonard's term was marked by a number of significant cultural shifts within the Combine. The first was the shock announcement of the construction of a new capital city on Luthien and the relocation of the Draconis government to that planet. New Samarkand, the ancestral home of House Kurita, was deemed too far away from the Lyran border to be able to conduct a successful defense, or offense, in the case of invasion. Luthien's more central location gave them a better strategic hold over the entire region, plus gave her populace a major project to work towards. The completion of Imperial City took decades, only concluding towards the end of the century. Leonard Kurita, who was a major patron of the arts, also started a revival of interest in ancient Japanese culture within the Combine. Though certain elements of this had always been of significance to the Kurita family, it was during her reign as coordinator, and encouraged by her successor Urizen II, that it really took off with the public too. The ruling Kuritans took advantage of this and pushed the parts that stressed obedience to one's elders or master. This has been one of the many ways they have managed to maintain such a high level of control over their realm's population for so many centuries. Sidera McAllister finally passed away in 2632, aged 136. She is almost certainly the most powerful woman in the history of the Draconis Combine. Her 3 terms as coordinator are unequalled, as are the suspected murders of 2 of her predecessors, her husband Warren back in 2517 and her grandson Leonard in 2605. The Free Worlds League had invested the most of any Innisphere nation into the rebuilding of the periphery, especially within the magistracy. Melissa Humphrey's Good Neighbour policies had kicked off a major economic boom for the Canopians. Their new state-of-the-art facilities, paired with a nation determined to prove their worth, soon created issues for the mercantile freeworlders, who found their aging industrial base could not keep up with the flood of goods coming across the border. For most of the 2620s, the Free Worlds League was suffering a major recession, and they were only able to claw themselves out of this hole with the emergence of several new technologies. The early 27th century had been less traumatic for the Federated Suns and Terran Hegemony compared to their fellow member states. The only significant event occurred with the handover of the former Taurian worlds to the Fed Suns, who were thrilled to have another 24 planets to exploit. On Terra, First Lord Ian Cameron had made it his mission to ensure that his realm would always be at the top of the pile, and launched several major research projects as part of his final act as First Lord, the Hegemony Ascendant Decree. Within the Starleague Accords were several prescriptions about sharing technology, which were envisioned to keep the more advanced Hegemony from having to share its secrets, particularly military ones, with their neighbours. The most significant development to come out of this period was the Hyperpulse Generator. This advancement would make possible the instantaneous transfer of information and communications from one star system to another without the need for courier jump ships. Though it was limited in range, in the early days it was no greater than that of the safe jump distance, it would still revolutionise the way people lived. The project was begun by Joshua Hashiko on April 4, 2614, but they couldn't overcome some of the fundamental challenges until Cassie de Burke joined the program in February 2616. De Burke, who was a free world scientist trying to overcome the same problems, often goes uncredited in the development of the HPG, and her name is all but unknown outside of the Marek League. Ultimately, it would take until January 1st, 2630 for the first successful broadcast between Terra and New Earth. The second major advancement was the development of the JU water purifier. This device not only outperformed its predecessors, but it was also smaller by an order of magnitude. Suddenly it became economical to colonise worlds that would never have been visited in the past. This truly ended all the economic troubles for the various states, as it opened up untapped sources of new raw materials and gave them new markets to sell to. By the end of the century, some estimates say as many as 1,000 new colonies had been established. In 2640, the First Lord's son, Joseph Cameron, launched a new tournament-style wargame called the Martial Olympiad. Held every 6 years on Mars, the competition was likened to an Olympic Games for the military. The soaring popularity of Joseph's initiative was indicative of just how fashionable the military was during the age of the Starleague. At first, only the SLDF could participate, but in later years the House militaries were invited, though none would ever be crowned overall champion. The good years came to an end in the mid-27th century with the emergence of a crisis within the Rimworld's Republic. The Amaris family had spent the last few decades in turmoil, launching successive coups and counter-coups that wiped out most of the ruling line. Salanta Amaris had come to power at a young age and had already survived an attempt by her regents to have her removed. By the late 2540s, she was firmly placed at the head of the Republic, but sadly took ill with a rare form of cancer. While she was undergoing medical treatment, she promoted her ambitious young nephew Taddeo, the Minister for Military Affairs, to rule in her place. His first actions as president were entirely predictable, and exactly what Salanta had secretly been hoping for. Taddeo was too worried about the loyalty of the Palace Guard to consider a takeover in his aunt's absence, but one group he did trust was the Rimworld's army. He began to aggressively expand the RWA, and by 2650 it was stronger than it had ever been pre-reunification war. Clandestine funding for this expansion came in part from the Draconis Combine, who sought to destabilise their mutual neighbour, the Lyran Commonwealth. Naturally, this drew the attention of the Starleague and the Council of Lords. The Lyrans were particularly concerned about the military build-up on their border. Unfortunately, nothing about Amaris' actions were illegal, as the Rimworld's Republic was not subjected to the harsh controls that the other periphery realms were post-reunification war, but rather was a co-signatory of the SLDF defence protocols. This left the High Council with three options. The first was to do nothing and potentially risk another Operation Mailed Fist if things got worse. The second was to launch a preemptive invasion themselves, thereby breaking all the laws of the Starleague. The third option was to make Taddeo's new army illegal. The Council Edict of 2650, which passed on November 15th, put strict limits on the numbers of soldiers the House militaries and other private armies could keep in active service. Directive 30 was one of the first laws passed by the new First Lord, Michael Cameron, and went a long way to achieving his great-grandfather Ian's dreams of the SLDF being an unmatched military juggernaut. Not everyone was happy with the new rules, however. The Draconis Combine, whose relationship with the Camerons had never fully recovered since Leonard's day, saw this as an attack on their sovereignty. This would lead Urizen II to further undermine Starleague authority within the Combine, and the member state moved ever further from unity. Taddeo Amaris, meanwhile, was forced to disband much of his new force, or else risk military intervention, something he could not hope to win. By 2642, each of the SLDF's corps that had fought in the reunification war had grown to a full army of 3 or 4 corps each. To make sure that Amaris followed the new directive, the LCAF conducted military maneuvers on Black Earth across the border. 5 BattleTech regiments and various support units were enough to intimidate the interim president into disbanding his new army. Salanta Amaris returned to power not long after the crisis. Everything had gone exactly how she had wanted. For starters, the RWA had grown in size as not all of Taddeo's forces were sent home. The new limits on the RWA allow for 12 BattleTech and 8 conventional regiments, a significant increase on the 2 combined arms regiments left after the reunification war. All this had been achieved without her name being associated with the build-up. Secondly, Taddeo's reputation, and by extension his threat to her, had been tarnished irreparably by the Star League's actions. In the aftermath of the crisis, 30 brand new Pinto-class corvettes were left without a purpose. Rather than decommission and deconstruct them, Salanta chose to mothball the new fleet. They would have to wait for another 100 years, but those ships would eventually find a place in the navy of her great-grandson, and participate in one of humanity's darkest chapters.